from Canberra. I might not be the sharpest knife in the block, a bit like a bread knife, cut through difficult subject matter and always leave crumbs on the board. Howdy folks, welcome to Canberra and Small. I've got an interview happening very shortly with a guy that you may know if you've watched seen any of my previous shows recently. His name's Mark. He is quite a powerful speaker, and he's an ex-school teacher. And because of a situation that happened a couple of years ago, he lost his job because he wouldn't take the steel, if you know what I mean. Well, he is been coming here every day for most of the last couple of years, and well, I caught up with him today, and I've asked him to jump in the back of the bus and have a bit of a chat. So, without any further ado, here's Mark.
Sounds like home with slamming the
door. Yeah.
Yep. Morning, everyone.
G'day, mate. Welcome to Amos Sewn number 676.
Oh, nice to be here, actually.
Yeah.
Am I in the show? Yeah, I can see myself.
You see yourself. The girls over. Okay. I was a school teacher before the last couple of years, and
yeah, I was.
You lost your job because you couldn't take the steel, is what I said.
Yeah.
So, if you would like to carry on from there.
Yeah. Basically, I felt that the voice, one of the things that our society has been doing over a period of time, it hasn't just happened, is we've been isolating people and removing their voice. And by that I mean that they no longer are paid, any attention is paid to them. They're seen but not heard, often not seen. And prior to going back to teaching, I was actually looking after my dad, who was in an aged care facility.
Yeah.
And that is a clear example of people who have no voice. It was amazing when you're in aged care who is in there and what they've done with their life, and it's such a it's such a thing on our society that we don't use that knowledge and we don't use that wisdom and life experience. We just lock them away.
Well, in a lot of societies still today, when people get old, the children look after them.
Yeah.
And which is it's the natural way. It's what should happen. And then you'll hear all the knowledge from those people, lock them away in a home, and you see what happens.
Yeah, my dad had a stroke, so he was a two-person lift. Otherwise, I would have had him at my place.
Yeah.
But it just and there is facilities to have people come, but it was just too difficult to work it.
That's the way society's been built that way, hasn't it now?
Yeah. And the sad part about it was when he had his stroke, they didn't do any physio, and we know the first 3 months they can get so much back. And he actually paid for physio for himself when he was in the home in Darwin, and they were getting him sitting up on the edge of the bed and being able to transfer himself. Because if you look at incapacitation, the more you get back, like there's a line where you can't move yourself, so you have to have two people to move you.
Yeah.
Once you can transfer yourself, then a whole new world opens up.
That's right.
But for me, the interesting thing that I saw in the homes were anyone that was too vocal was shut up by chemical restraints, which is illegal. And I got well versed with the complaint system, made a number of complaints, but more importantly, you need to stand up for your loved ones. If you can't have them at home, they have to take notice of a family member. They can't just ignore them. And my dad passed in January of 2020. He chose how he went. He basically, we had a day out and he did twice of everything he normally does. He went home and had dinner, and then they put him to bed, and an hour later he was gone. So, for me, it was a relief because I knew what we had coming up. When things start to deteriorate, life becomes more difficult. So but for me, one of the things I started to realize once the 2020, and we had the government bring all sorts of wonderful mandates in. I thought mandates was what my sister went on, but anyhow, they had no legal basis. I think for me, what exposed things to me from the first, because like you take information that you're given, and so the only information we had about it was vision out of China, and they had people dropping dead in the street, which was pretty scary. And we now know that the media basically fabricates so much, and
Well, that, folks.
and because the media are reporting on the media, and the interesting thing for me was the government had two departments set up over the last 3.5 years or so to actually remove and to delete and to have them kicked off social media. Anything that anyone who had a voice that was different, saying something slightly different to what the government said. And we now have a legislation coming in that if it passes both houses, and it looks like it will, then you will be told by the government what the truth is. It'll be their truth. That's North Korea. That's the worst of things, because they want to shut people's voice down. And so when I saw early, I think it was March of 2020, where every premier of every state in Australia were saying exactly the same thing, I realised that they were lying to us, because
Or reading from the same script.
Because I've never in my life ever seen two premiers agree on anything, even from the same. If it was Labor or Liberal, it doesn't matter. They don't agree on anything, and that seemed to be that. That was the first thing I saw that showed me that this was not what it seemed. That this was an organised event, because you don't have scripts unless you've got an organised event. And so I felt that what I could do is see, government is scared of numbers. It's a numbers game. If there's too many bodies turn up in a place, then they'll do whatever they can to remove them. And we saw that in Canberra last year. They use the police as bully boys, and they break the law because they're told we won't take any complaints against you. And we know in the ACT, no complaint is taken seriously against any police officer. I know I've made a complaint.
Yeah.
I've tried to help others to make a complaint. It's just they will not accept them. They've been told. So if you want your police force to act illegally, and I've seen police act illegally numerous times, most times, at the very least, they're lying to you about jurisdiction, etc., because Canberra's a complicated place with that. So you just tell them they can get away with whatever they want. That's what happened in Nazi Germany. And we had brown shirts that burnt places down and killed people, and there was no consequences. We haven't quite got there yet, but using so-called non-lethal weapons in Victoria, which have is it a 6 or 8% lethal? So one in every 100 bullets you shoot and hit someone, 8 people will be killed by it.
And how many of them will actually be badly injured anyway if they're not killed?
Well, that's it.
Much higher percentage, I'm sure, than 8%.
But they didn't really care about that. And we've seen them use other weapons here, which is plausible deniability. That's what I love about it.
Yeah.
And so, people say, "Oh, you've just been paranoid." No, I've actually seen evidence. I've seen the burn marks on people from red radium burns from things, and I've seen people sick with the same disease. Yeah. So, but coming back to the voice, one of the things that initially I did was I came to protest so that they could count me, that I stand up and be counted, because I think it's important. Then I came to Canberra. I had to work, so we left. My mate and I left the Gold Coast on the Monday after the big rally, so that was the 13th, and we arrived on the Tuesday. And by that stage, they were in Canberra.
Is that the weekend after the Epic?
That's it.
Right, yeah, I arrived on a Monday.
And so, people were still arriving. People didn't know where anyone was, and on the radio, the police were saying to people, if you see anyone with a flag, let us know. We'll go and deal with them. That was the condition in Canberra,
Yeah.
which is unacceptable in any shape, size, or form. And it's unacceptable because under our so-called democracy, we have the right to not only stand in disagreement with the government because they're supposed to represent us. I say supposed to because I don't think they do. Their program seems to be driven by other things other than the people of Australia. Um, and so one of the things that I realised because I had to go home in April to re-sign my lease. Um, so I went home for 3 days in April. And when I was away from Canberra, um, you get to view things differently. And there were two things that I saw very clearly. The first was I had to start to speak. I have a gift to speak. I've always found that to be something that is not that's not me, but it's a gift that flows through me, and I have the ability to use words. Um, and so I felt that there was time to start to talk. That yes, I was a body, showing that the numbers, but also I think that it's important that we speak. And now, freedom of speech is under attack like nothing before. And so I started to speak, and I realized it was, that was the best thing I could do for those without voice, was to speak. And I saw, I've seen things in Canberra done by police, in particular, um, that should never happen in this country. They are North Korean style tactics. Um, I was at the front of the Governor General's house, outside the gate on the Friday night of the 22nd of April, just before Anzac Day. And we had permission. We negotiated with the senior officer, AFP officer, in front of the gate to protest there. And we had a person dressed in a police uniform come down. I say a person because they refused to identify themselves, and they gave us a order to move on, or they would come and arrest us all. And the thing with Canberra is jurisdiction. So I asked him the question, under which jurisdiction is he giving us move on order? Because we were exactly where the gatehouse had asked us to be. We negotiated that previously in the day, and he refused to identify himself, which is against his own regulations. He refused um, to say under which jurisdiction he was operating under, and he refused to even talk about the law which he was applying in his move on order. What happened then was that the officers from the gatehouse came over and they apologised and said, no, he's representing the people that have ownership of the land where, control of the land where we were, but we could move back to the car park where we normally would do our protesting, and they were happy for us to be there indefinitely because we'd been there at that stage since the 7th of February every day. So they were happy that we had respect on both sides. So we did. We all moved our cars down. We had to park them three, and we moved ourselves. We abide by the move on order, and then the police cars started arriving. I counted over 90 police cars. 90, and they were still
How many
arriving.
cars did you guys have?
We would have probably had 12, probably 40 cars.
Yeah.
Each one had their car.
Mm-hmm.
And then they started assembling behind the gates, and they came out in two lines and basically grabbed, assaulted, um, imprisoned falsely. Kidnapping is what it's called under armed kidnapping, and basically behaved like thugs. They had no jurisdiction. We've proven that now through the courts. They had no authority to do what they did. We had permission to be there by the relevant people. but they didn't care.
Mhm.
And I actually went down before they came out and spoke clearly to them about the fact that they were about to act illegally. So, because I believe that we owe people, if someone's going to do something that's illegal, we owe it to them to let them know.
Yeah.
So there's no excuses. And so I went down and spoke at length, almost 20 minutes, about what the law was, what the jurisdiction was, and how that we had already complied with the move on order. And that if they came out of that gate, that they would be breaking the law. And still there was probably, 2 lines of police that stretched probably 20 metres. So my point at that was that I wanted to get arrested. If they were going to falsely arrest us, if they were going to assault us, then I wanted to be involved in that so I could go to a court and have a court deal with the issue. Because at that stage, I still believed that we had a court system that actually followed the law. And thankfully, one of the guys who was arrested was actually assaulted by a senior officer, which we had on camera, and he had it on. It was also seen on body cam, and he was actually charged with assaulting a police officer because this police officer
was assaulted.
Yeah, this police officer was a senior man. In fact, he was the same. Turned out later, I didn't realise it at the time. He was actually the person who had come down and didn't identify himself and gave us a move on order. The person was the protester was held by 4 or 5 different officers on the ground, and this police officer stood over him and struck him in the stomach, abdomen, twice, and on the 3rd time, this guy moved his hand to block the strike, and that was sufficient to be charged for resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer. So what happened was they arrested a number of people, and then they decided they would unarrest them. Why? Because they knew that no one had authority. What they were doing was totally illegal. Why did they do that? Oh, well, someone up the tree had told them to do that. Who was it? Was it the Governor General? Was it the Prime Minister at the time? I don't know. But David Croft, you acted illegally. You acted not according to your own code of conduct. You used language unbefitting an officer of your standing, and you refused to identify yourself. You refused to identify your rank. You refused to identify the station you were from, and you also acted in an illegal manner, which the courts have now shown to be illegal. So I'm naming you because you refused to name. You were the one that we have vision assaulting one of our protesters. So you are still in Canberra, as far as I know. You need to be disciplined by the relevant authorities for the actions from the 22nd of April. I did make a formal complaint against you. I was spent a lot of time on that. I spent all afternoon doing it, and I got a bot's response, which had no relevance to what I complained against. So,
how typical is that? Yeah. And well, you've been here quite a lot since then too, haven't you?
I've basically been here since the time I got here. I've been home. Last year I went home twice. Went to Adelaide twice, and then this year I went to help my partner move from Adelaide to the Gold Coast. So we drove up together, came through Canberra, and I had to sort my house out to make room for her so she could fit, basically. So I was away about 6 weeks at that time, and then I've been back since. So I'm committed to being here until we get this done. We've been over 500 days in front of the governor every day, and that brings pressure. I've personally been asking the governor a question, which I'm going to ask again on your show.
Quite okay.
There is a young man by the name of Adrian John Wells, who on 3 occasions has publicly accused you, David Hurley, of raping him as a child and trafficking him as a child when you were a commissioned officer in the Armed Forces of Australia. And I'm asking you the question, David Hurley, are you a child rapist and a child trafficker? Because it's a very serious accusation, and we need to hear from you. He accused you on Anzac Day last year, 2022, and and basically since then you have your silence has been deafening. So my feeling about it is um, that someone in your position should either step down or at least, the very least, make a personal statement about your innocence or your guilt in this matter. And so I've made it a point that I believe very strongly about to ask you that question every day, because the answer needs to be heard. Uh, I know you've had advice, we assume, from your advisors to um, not respond to anything, which I believe is against your office. You have a responsibility to the people of Australia under your office, but if you choose not to speak under your office, you should at least speak about these very serious matters. And so I'm going to continue to ask you the question, and I'm doing it the only way I know to get through to you, which is publicly through broadcasting, until I get an answer from you. And at this point, your silence is deafening. I've been asking that question every day in front of your house for over a month and a half now, and I will continue to do so until I hear your answer. And whatever answer you want to make, that's your choice. But until you answer me, I'm going to continue asking the question. So that's just my little thing. I just think that if you, under our structure of government, the Governor General is the chief, he's the highest position in the land. He's also the Commander-in-Chief of the military, and no one should be in that position with that accusation unanswered.
Right.
That's just
It
the
shouldn't be
simple
that
as
hard, should it?
no, it's not.
Mm.
And I know from what I've learnt about David Hurley is that he's quite a, he has great pride in what he does.
Mm-hmm.
Some would call it arrogance. Let's use the word pride. And silence coming from him is unbecoming to him and his position. So, David, I welcome your response. You know where we are every day. I prefer to hear you use your voice because that's what your voice is used for. But we're here waiting for your answer.
Come and visit us at the rock garden.
Yeah, it's quite simple.
Yeah.
So yeah, look, at the moment there's this big argument, well, not argument. There's a big discussion going on in our society about giving the voice to the Indigenous people. Now, what a lot of people don't realise is I'm actually an Indigenous person myself, and as such, um, um, I believe that this is the biggest um, lie perpetrating against Australian people since the last lie that this government has pushed, which you don't have to look very far for that.
A couple of years ago.
Why is it a lie? Well, because at the moment there is a committee of Indigenous people paid for by the government who advise the Prime Minister on Indigenous matters and also provides advice to the Cabinet on legislation and how the Indigenous point of view of it. So my question is, what more will the voice do? Because they've already got that. We pay just over $2 billion a year for that group. And I don't hear Albanese say anything about that group. He has them as on tap to answer any questions he has about the Indigenous point of view. The second thing is that I was in Botany Bay last month when the group of Indigenous elders got together to voice their no vote, and there was a speaker who spoke about the Uluru Declaration, which has been that's been supposedly the catalyst for this change to the Constitution. And what he said was that all the delegates that were voted for by the different Indigenous communities from around Australia had left the meeting before the vote was taken. So whose vote was it? That was from an Indigenous elder who was actually there. So, that's the basis of the government wanting to do this. The third thing is it's a referendum, and as a referendum, I don't understand how you can have a yes and a no argument without first putting up what the question's going to be. It is a change to the fundamental law of our which is our constitution. We need a 2/3 majority to pass it in each of the states and a majority of the states, and it will affect every other law in this country. And to be fair, you cannot have arguments for or against it if you don't know what is going to be changed. The government is large on noise about it and very scarce on actual facts about it. We don't know when it's going to be. We don't know what they're going to be wanting to change. Until we have that, we can't make any sort of response. But for me, it comes down to this fundamental thing. Do we trust the government? I don't know a Indigenous person who is not paid by the government to do a job who actually thinks that this is a good idea. In fact, everyone I talk to is adamant against it because they believe it's going to take their sovereignty away in this country. So that's just my position on that. So it's interesting that they're pushing something where there's no information on it. They've produced a
one-page document.
Well, they produced the brochure with two sides of the equation. But how can you argue when you don't know what they're going to change? It's just it's fog, mirrors, and I have a saying, and I've been using it very much in the last 4 years, and that is, don't let facts get in the way of a good story. You know, the facts of the matter are sadly lacking.
And we don't know what they're doing, do we?
Yeah. As usual. And you know, there was a vote with referendum to back in the late 60s, was it, where the Aboriginal people would be allowed to have the vote.
Yep.
What came out of that was that their position is less powerful now than it was prior to that, from a legal perspective. So take it as you may. I was also in a court yesterday, and I was flabbergasted when I heard a special magistrate, actually rule on the Constitution. Because my understanding is the magistrates' courts don't have the jurisdiction, only the High Court does, to rule on that. But he felt comfortable enough to rule on it. And what he said was about a section of the Constitution was that even though it had not been changed by referendum, that enough water had gone under the bridge it didn't apply.
Yeah, that statement was a bit out there, wasn't it?
It was very out there. The Constitution is not...
it's not a vibe.
It's not a vibe. It's not a feeling. The Constitution is our foundational document. Every law that is passed by any parliament in this country has to abide by the Constitution. And I know that they've been doing stuff changing the Constitution without referendum, which they can pretend to do whatever they like, but without a referendum, it's not legal. And that's why do you think they're pushing a referendum for the voice? Which tells me that there's something in the in the Constitution they need to change drastically, and so this is their trigger to do so. So, do we trust them? Not at all. The other thing I want to talk about, and this is really important, is that we are here, as you can see, to expose the 28. Now, the 28 high-profile accused pedophiles. One of the things that I'm flabbergasted with is that the government think it's okay to protect them. I believe that these people are missing out on their basic rights as Australians, and that is to face a court of law with their accusations. They are not doing that. They are being hidden by the government, both federal and the state of New South Wales. From what we understand, because with a suppression order, they suppress the knowledge of the suppression order. Becomes very tricky. Why would you do that? We know that the Wood Royal Commission were given documents that would normally be given to a prosecutor to prosecute these people. Why would they do that? Because they couldn't find a court in New South Wales that would prosecute these people for pedophilia.
How can a court say that they can't? That doesn't make sense to me, but carry
Well,
on.
we know that there were a number of judges on that.
Hmm.
Maybe the fraternity didn't want it. We also know that Wood, once he saw it come across his desk because his QC signed off on it, we don't, unless you understand legally how a Royal Commission works, signing off on it just seems like, oh, we put his signature on it. No, it means a lot more than that. A Royal Commission gets a license from the Crown to have what they call terms of reference, which is things that they are legally allowed to look at. And since the law was changed, they have teeth to look at it. So they can compel people to produce documents. They can compel people to come and be cross-examined. They can actually lay charges against people. Now, so you have normally a judge who runs the show. In that case, it's Wood. Prior to that, Fitzgerald Royal Commission in Queensland, again against police corruption, he was also a judge. So normally it's a judge that runs the Royal Commission, and the terms of reference of Wood's Royal Commission changed 3 times, which is very unusual, and it went over 3 years. But what happened was his QC, because of what they can't do all the technical work themselves, so they have QCs, which are Queen's Counsels, which are basically barristers were able to speak before the Queen's Counsel, which was the highest court in the land before they stopped our right to go to the Privy Council. Now the High Court is our only last court of appeal, which is to do that without changing the Constitution, but they do that. So basically, what happens with the QCs, they accept the documents, and they then have to figure out, firstly, where they're from, whether they're actually credible. And coming from a group of police, they were considered to be credible, and also had to check whether they fit the terms of reference.
Mm-hmm.
And so they did, because at the time, terms of reference had included anyone involved with the boy brothel in King's Cross,
Mm-hmm.
Costello brothel, and so he accepted it. And so Wood, I don't know whether he knew it was coming up, but the moment he hit his desk to be the next thing to be discussed, he called it a recess and never went back to it. And when he was asked by Heffernan much later why he didn't, he said, I will deny ever saying this, but we decided not to revisit that issue because the public would lose confidence in the judiciary, which just tells you how many of the judiciary were involved on that list, as far as I could see.
It's a sorry indictment of where we are.
Yeah, but they had a problem because it had already been accepted.
Hmm.
So within the documents of the Wood Royal Commission is this document. So we know that the state government were not wanting to come out, so they actually suppressed it through the Supreme Court, because that was a relevant court. Then we see, according to Heffernan's speech in 2015, the documents turn up at the Attorney General in Canberra in 2003. His name was Ruddock, and from what we've heard on the grapevine, because it's very difficult getting information, but everyone knows everything in Canberra.
Yeah.
Someone worked with someone. Howard's niece worked for his department, not Howard's department, for the Governor General's department, and somehow she was involved in getting Howard to approach the Governor General to suppress those documents. Now, General Jeffreys was the Governor General at the time. He would have been advised by the Prime Minister, I would assume, this is all assumption of course, that it needed to be suppressed, and so he would have suppressed it and suppressed the knowledge of it. How do we know that it was the Governor General? Because of, really for me, 2 things. The first thing is knowing how you can bring a suppression order in. There's only 3 ways of doing it. First way is through a court, which is what New South Wales did. Second is through an Act of Parliament. Third is through the Act of the Governor General. That's why it's such a joke when they say that he has no power. He makes ordinances, which are laws that govern federal land in Canberra, and the ACT is controlled by the federal government, and he makes them without anyone else's help. It's called an ordinance, and it's a law. That's the Governor General's authority. So don't be fooled into thinking he's just a figurehead with no power. He does make some interesting laws, as he did in. I think there was one that was released on the 1st of April. We thought it was an April Fool's joke because it was so poorly written, but it was written to try and get rid of us out of Canberra, as far as I could see from what I read of it. So anyhow, going back to that, we also know that was the first thing. The second thing is we know it was the Governor General because Heffernan tells us that every Attorney General since Ruddock has had a copy of the documents. Why would you need a copy of the documents? Because if it's suppressed, who is obligated to act on behalf of the suppression order in case one of these 28 people appear before a court charged with pedophilia?
Yes.
So the most senior law enforcement officer in this country, the Federal Attorney General, job is to protect these pedophiles from ever facing court. So instead of them being Australia's most wanted, which is what I believe they are literally Australia's most protected.
And they can go do whatever they want, and probably are doing it right now.
Yeah, because if they ever come before court, ever with historical or now, the Attorney General, Federal Attorney General, would step in and it would disappear.
Yeah, well, to go to court though, they'd have to be arrested. Can't see that happening.
No, I don't think that would be happening either. So that was the second thing. And so for me, people talk about Heffernan getting an order to produce the documents to the Royal Commission into the institutional treatment of children, which he mentions in his speech. That speech is very crucial. Was where we get information from because it's actually in the government record.
Yeah.
They would hope that it wasn't, but it is.
Yep. Hansard
does record it, although it does vary in a couple of places from the actual recording of it, I've seen of it, which is quite interesting. I thought Hansard is supposed to be an exact. So, but one of the things that Heffernan said was that he'd got an order to produce. He produced the documents to the Royal Commission. They put the documents up against the terms of reference and decided they could not accept it because it dealt with a lot of the legal profession, and the legal profession weren't considered to be an institution. So what he did was he went to the relevant body, which was the Senate Committee into the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, because they had the power to declare, yes, the legal fraternity is in fact an organisation and therefore can come under the terms of reference. Now they didn't do that. They were too interested in estimates and about money, but that was why Heffernan made his famous speech from 2015, and that's why other senators gave him their time because they wanted it dealt with. What was interesting watching the Vision is seeing the then Attorney General, Federal Attorney General, Branders, shitting bricks a couple of times because he thought that Heffernan might actually, under parliamentary privilege, name the names, read the charges. He could have done the whole thing. He would have seen the Federal Attorney General trying to shout him down, but he had the right to do that. And he actually says, I chose not to do that in his speech because I have no respect for it, because the more I see them covering it up, the more I wonder why they would protect child rapists and child traffickers.
I think it might be more than 28.
Well, we know it's more than 28. People say, well, why are you focused on the 28? Because for me, this is it's the head of the boil. We have a festering boil of corruption and treason against the Australian people, of a lot of people in high places. I don't know how far it reaches. All I know is I see it everywhere. I see the High Court ruling against the Constitution, as they did with when they were asked to rule on whether the states have physical borders or not.
All right.
And under the Constitution, it's quite clear the only border that's recognised is the Australian border, not individual state
Mhm.
borders. They are actually administrative zones because the states are given the area to administer, and as such, the Constitution is quite clear. You cannot forbid people travelling and conducting commerce across the borders.
Mhm.
So to close internal borders is actually against the Constitution, but the High Court for some reason decided that they weren't going to uphold the Constitution in that matter. So they ruled against that and allowed West Australia to do that. Then, of course, there's issues with the fact um, that on the 13th of March 2020, the Governor General, David Hurley, signed a declaration of a federal pandemic under the Biosecurity Act 2015, which meant, if you understand at all how our system of government works in a commonwealth, in a federation, is that the moment it becomes a federal issue, it's a national issue, which we know it was. Um, the state governments have no authority to act independent of the federal law. The only law that applies in this matter to do with the pandemic was the Biosecurity Act 2015. So anything the states did outside of that Biosecurity Act was illegal. The states had the moment it was declared a federal pandemic, the states could not do anything within their own power. They had to work with the government under the Biosecurity Act.
And gee, what did they do?
Mm.
What did the state governments all around the country,
And
well, like West Australia, for example, did
well, they all
yeah,
did. I'm
yeah,
from Queensland.
all right, yeah,
They closed the
all the
border.
borders. Yep.
Yeah, they did all sorts of things. But the thing is, when you read the Biosecurity Act, and we know that they tried to fiddle with it in 2020, 21, and they made changes.
Mm.
But it was as when it was declared, which was the 13th of March 2020. The
Mhm.
Biosecurity Act, as it stood then, had no. Um, the Biosecurity Act could not order a whole population to be locked up, quarantined, if you wanted to use the term, although they didn't use that term.
Mm.
You could not forbid people from leaving their homes unless a order was made under the Biosecurity Act. Now, the Biosecurity Act 2015 has provision there for an order to be made for someone to go into quarantine. But there are very clear conditions of that. Firstly, they must be showing positive signs of the disease, i.e., symptoms of the disease. You cannot be asymptomatic and actually have a order under the Biosecurity Act. I believe that asymptomatic was just simply poor um, uh, detection,
Mm.
false positives, because we know that the detection methodology was not very accurate. And so false positives had to be explained away, and so they were asymptomatic. But under the Biosecurity Act, you couldn't lock someone up unless they had active symptoms, and they had the right to appear before the court, a court run
Mhm.
by the Biosecurity Act under their setup to argue why he shouldn't be locked up.
Yeah.
So and that's quite clear. The other thing is that the Biosecurity Act is incredibly clear that police, neither federal police or state police, are to be used as officers to enforce anything under the Biosecurity Act 2015.
Mhm.
And who were the thugs that
Mhm.
were bashing people, shooting people, grabbing people, arresting them? They were all unauthorized agents under the Biosecurity Act. What else did the Biosecurity Act say? Well, it said that you couldn't shut a whole population down. Had nothing about closing borders. Um, you know, but it was interesting to me because I saw the federal government set it up so that the states broke the law,
Mm.
but it would have been federal courts, including up to the High Court, that would have had to take action of it, and it would have had to have been well, ultimately the Governor General should have said something and insisted that the states did the legal thing under the Biosecurity Act. The federal government definitely had that power, but I think the federal government were playing a game of following the Biosecurity Act and refusing to enforce the enforce the fact there was a federal pandemic through the courts, which they should have,
Yeah.
or at least say something.
Oh.
In fact, I remember
Excuse
seeing
me.
both the Hunt, who was the health minister at the time, and ScoMo, who was the prime minister at the time, both say that when the vaccines came out, that they were not mandated, even though at the same time the states were forcing people to get vaccinated.
Well, they're not forcing you. You just couldn't go to work if you didn't.
You couldn't leave your home. You
Couldn't leave your
couldn't
home.
go to a pub. You couldn't go to a shopping centre. You couldn't go anywhere, supposedly.
Supposedly, yeah, but that's not forcible,
So
is it?
so it seemed to me like it was the same sort of thing as they've done in Canberra, where they've definitely said to the AFP, we won't hold you accountable for any of your legal actions. We're not going to take any complaint against that. We're not taking any action against that. I think the federal government did exactly the same thing with the states and allowed the states to act as the bully boys to break the law with immunity. But you need to understand, as an Australian, as someone who lives in this country, you need to understand that the states had no legal right at all to act independent of the Biosecurity Act once the federal pandemic was declared. The other interesting thing is that in the last budget, where the government did very little to help Australians who were struggling to put food on the table, pay the rent, pay the mortgage, that they put $1 billion aside. That's $1,000 million aside for COVID. 100 million of that was put in. I've seen some of that advertising. The advertising is actually against the facts that have come out through the media. Even the mainstream media have talked about that. They said two things about the vaccine. One, that it was going to stop you getting COVID. Safe and effective were the two terms they used. That's not a lie. It's actually two lies. It's now been proven that there's no difference whether you got the vaccine or not, in how whether you got it or not, or how severe it was. So that's now in the public domain.
Yeah.
And yet
Most people realise that, but
the government is advertising on national television to keep your guard up, get another booster. And they know from their own experts that it's not protecting. So they're actually lying to the Australian people, using $100 million of our money to do so. The second thing about it is that the Australian government have said, they can't really do much with the Reserve Bank. If the Reserve Bank puts up interest rates, then they're an independent body and they can't interfere with that. It was interesting when the governor of the Reserve Bank announced he's stepping down. Who was in the meeting, acting like they were involved with the decision making? There was the treasurer and the prime minister. But they don't have no say at all.
No, of course not.
But what's come out now from the economists that aren't paid off by the government is that our inflation numbers that the Reserve Bank have been using to up the interest rates, what is it, 13 times in the last...
Something like that,
12 times in the last 14 months or something.
Yep.
The number one driving force for the inflation that they're using is actually rents going up.
Yeah.
Because food's taken out of it. We know food's been going up, but the food is removed, is rents. Now, the Australian federal government has given permission for, I think it's 660,000 immigrants. Most of them will end up in Sydney and Melbourne. That's all Canberra. That's just how it is. And the interesting thing about that is that that's what's causing the demand on rental properties. When there's demand on rental properties prices go up. And because they're going up, interest rates have been going up. So whose decision is it to put the interest rates up? Yeah, it's the Reserve Bank, but who created the conditions for that to happen?
Exactly.
The government.
Hmm.
And then they've got this. The last week, Albanese was threatening to go if he couldn't pass his housing legislation, which is so important. That he would use that as a double disillusionment trigger, which means that everyone in the Senate, not just half the Senate, goes to the polls, and everyone in the House of Representatives. This is a way of clearing out the Senate, because the Senate serve 6 years and the House of Reps serve 3, so every time the House of Reps go up, only half the Senate goes. But a double disillusionment, everyone goes.
Mm-hmm.
But do you know what the bill is? I was flabbergasted when I was reading that what the government wants to do is borrow billions of dollars and play the stock market, and the money they make on the stock market they will use to buy housing. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, is there? And I think they plan on building, they should raise enough to build 10,000 houses a year.
Yeah, that'll work.
That'll work. Now,
Not.
It's like the government borrowing money to play lotto.
Yeah.
Because we know, anyhow. But the interesting thing about it is they could do that quite easily by cutting the immigration numbers by 10,000. Suddenly you got 10,000 dwellings that are now available.
Yeah.
You don't have to wait for them to be built. It also would take a little bit of pressure off the rental markets, wouldn't it?
Which would take pressure off interest rates.
Which would cause, So there's but just so you know, I mean, look, I've become more aware of what the government's doing lately, but what they did is they made politics so boring that no one was interested in following what they were doing. And that when they're not being held accountable for what they're doing,
do whatever they want.
That's when you start seeing them do things that they really don't have the right to do. And they've been doing that since the 70s. So even before I could vote, they were trying to make it so boring that I wouldn't be interested in what they were doing. And most people aren't.
Yeah.
The ABC shows Question Time, and how many people sit and watch that?
Yeah.
Like we had more people at our Anzac, watching our service for the fallen, which we do every day, than the war memorial had when they did it.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. So why? Because and make no mistake, it's a deliberate act. Make it so boring that no one knows what is interested in learning about what's going on, and make it so complicated. The laws could be written very simply, but they're not. They're written very complicated because that allows them to hide other things in there. And so, yeah.
And then dress it up to look good, sort of thing. But it's really
well. For me,
bend over, please.
Yeah, for me, names are really, really important. I notice that every dictatorship has in the name of their country democratic.
Yeah.
I think we should be adding democratic to Australia, because we're heading. If this a misinformation bill comes through,
that's dangerous.
We will be along with the despots, because the government will decide what is misinformation. So if it's against their narrative, against their lies to the people, you're in disinformation and you can be jailed for it. Shut you up. See, again, it's the voice. What am I here for? To give a voice to those who have no voice. It has taken away, and they're still doing it. They're still legislating to do it. Now, I like to remind the government that there was $20 billion. They've now found another billion. $21 billion surplus they found in their budget they did not know existed. Well, why does it exist? Well, let me give you some idea of what $21 billion is. It's 21,000 million. Not 1,000 million, 21,000 million. It's a lot of money. Put it this way, it's enough to give pretty much every adult in Australia. How much?
Not quite a million, but
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah.
You know, so, but they've got this extra money in the budget because um, if you've had your tax return done recently, you realise you're not getting back what you thought you were going to get back. Why? Because there was some things to do
Yeah.
with the Tax Act that you had allowances for, and now they're no longer
No,
offering them.
they've just cancelled it.
No, it came to an
That
end,
came
but the
to an end.
government didn't renew it.
Right,
They
yeah.
chose not. And actually, Albanese was asked
Mm,
straight out by a reporter why they didn't consider to renew it.
mm.
You know what his answer was?
What?
Wasn't. He didn't give an answer. He just started waffling about how bad the previous government was.
Misdirection, yeah.
And actually, like a real reporter, most of them don't.
Mm,
He said, "But you haven't answered my question."
mm.
So, you know, the Australian people are struggling. There's make no mistake. You know, everybody's struggling because interest rates have got exposed in their borrowing. We are overexposed in the borrowing because we've just come out of 3 years of basically sitting on our ass at home, not being able to do much. So, you know, we renovated, we bought a new car, we went on that holiday, we did a lot of things, and we borrowed money against our property. And so, you know, that's part of the control of us. You know, if if um, if we had bills to pay, that was the pressure to come to bear to fold to the government's demands.
Mhm.
That's how they did it. You know, um, so I'm aware of how desperate things are in the Australian people. You know, and the government here is, uh,
They don't care.
Albanese's, has styled himself as a person who understands the common man and comes from the common man.
Anthony always overseas he.
Yeah. I suggest that he actually gets off his ass and stops visiting other countries for photo opportunities and actually go down to Western Sydney or Victoria or anywhere where the common man is and start asking them about it and try and justify why they are sitting on 21,000 million that they could actually put
Mm.
to maybe cut our taxes a little bit
Yep.
or to do something constructive with the cost of living instead of doing what he's doing at the moment, which is
And
nothing.
making things worse, basically.
Yeah. So, you know, how do we stop the rent going up? Well, we need to stop the number of people coming into this country. And the reason they need so many people is they say that there are key jobs they can't get: nurses, teachers, police officers, ambulance drivers, even bus drivers. Why can't they get those people? Well, those people haven't died. Those to overseas,
They're still here.
they're still here, and most of them would want to go back and work those jobs, but they're not allowed to because they refused a medical procedure, and they are now being punished by their jobs never coming back to them.
Mm.
They are giving them to overseas workers, which I got nothing against overseas
No, not
workers,
at all.
but that's disgusting.
Mm.
I'm not blaming the overseas workers. I'm blaming
No,
the
they're
government.
just looking for a better life,
That's
which
it.
is like,
And
uh,
I don't know whether you're aware, but both a number of the states have been advertising overseas for police officers. In fact,
mm,
Queensland
mm,
has gone as far as saying that they'll go to third world countries and grab police officers. And it was interesting. They made this announcement a week after they changed the law that allowed police officers to take $20,000 in gifts without decoration. Well, if you're getting
really,
someone from one of these third world countries, they live on graft,
yeah.
so you have to make it possible. So yeah. So this is the Australia we're now living in. Am I against overseas people? Not at all. I spent a lot of time overseas. I love the diversity that we have in this country, but um, I see the people in this country from all walks of life are really doing it tough.
Mm.
The only like I don't see a lot of it in Canberra because this is the fatted cow here, and everyone's latched onto a tit, and they're getting. We've got a lot of bureaucrats being overpaid, pushing bits of paper around.
Hmm.
Um, that's my opinion. Um, what's interesting is they also, as part of their employment, have to sign um, I don't know what you'd call it, but something that means that if they are seen with us, even talking with us, that they can be sacked on the spot.
Thus, as in the
Protesters.
yeah.
We're not allowed to identify with protesters. Is that interesting? So yeah, this is.
I didn't know that. I'm sure none of the audience really.
Yeah.
Not many people
So,
know that.
well, we didn't know that until we started having people come very quietly to us and tell us how much they appreciate what we're doing, but that they aren't able to show any public support or be seen with us.
Lose their job.
Yep. And some of them on very cushy jobs.
Doesn't sound like blackmail, does it?
No, it's not blackmail.
No,
the government just doesn't want the people working for them knowing the truth. Yeah. Because they want them to
believe. They know the truth, but they just can't talk about it. Yeah.
Well, yeah. But then look, once this law comes in, I'll be in jail because I refuse to shut up about telling the truth. Mm-hmm. Don't let truth get in the way of a good story is really been the way things are operating. And then we get to the pedophiles, and it's I find it very interesting that in the last couple of weeks there's been 2 major stories about arresting pedophiles. Yeah. There's one disgusting example of a human who's been involved with childcares. Yep. And then there's a ring of computer experts, apparently IT experts who have been caught. Again, it's smoke and mirrors. Where are the high-profile pedophiles are facing court? Yeah. These are the minions. These are the
little villains.
These are the ones that seem to suggest to us, the government's doing something against pedophilia, while they're protecting their own. I'm sorry, but these 28 are clearly the most protected people in Australia. They're not the most wanted, they're most protected. And that's unacceptable. I'm not asking for anything other than that they have their case heard in a court of law. Yeah. That's what every person has a right to, and I expect them to have that same right.
One thing I did notice about that story about that childcare worker, I read a couple of stories about it, and a couple of days later I was preparing for a show, and I thought, well, I'll just go and reread those stories. Nowhere to be found.
Are they? That's interesting.
Yeah, yes. Couldn't find them. Well, I'm not the sharpest knife in the block, but maybe I didn't search enough sort of thing, but should have been. I looked at the ABC's site, I couldn't find the results. I went to history and found the story. Sorry, that's Chaffee from South Korea.
Oh, okay.
He's got a radio program.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm busy.
Yeah, and the other thing for me, which was interesting, is that just out of ACT is Cooma, where they had this elderly person assaulted by the police using tasers.
Yep.
Apparently she had a knife and she was coming towards them on a walking frame. She was 90, was she?
93, I think.
93, yeah. Now, I have a question. Who is the second officer that was reported to have tasered her? Because suddenly they've dropped out of the narrative. Who are they and why are they being protected? Because they're throwing one of them under the bus, but the other one, we don't even hear their name mentioned. And yet the initial story that I read, and of course the media will always tell the truth, was that both of them tasered her.
Really? I didn't hear that part, but yeah.
Yeah, so maybe it was only one, but why is that person not mentioned? He was there. He was involved in the call-out. He was in the room. We know that the police have body cam footage that they won't release. So why are they throwing one of them under the bus and the other one has disappeared from the narrative? Does that make you suspicious? Makes me suspicious because I'm now starting to see how they do it. Have a look at this hand, because this hand's doing something you don't want them to know about. Every time you see a big story that gets people emotively involved, the last story I remember with that was probably that submarine that went missing down near the Titanic. What are they trying to hide? Because that was 2 or 3 days of holding your breath. Occasionally there's a kid falls down a well, and the same thing happens. There's always something significant happening. Well,
Mm.
when that was happening, they were talking about charges against Hunter Biden, apparently,
Oh, right.
and
Yeah.
other things were happening in
That's all. I
America.
remember that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but the news didn't cover any of that.
No.
This
Mm.
was far too far. Yeah, well, he's
Oh.
obviously. Yeah. So look,
Mm.
I try to keep a level head, and I try and keep, thinking, there are good people out there in these positions, and I've met probably two AFP officers in my
Mm.
time who haven't lied to me,
Mm-hmm. Right.
and I've met hundreds.
Yeah.
I'm talking from the most senior officers,
Mm.
down to the person in the
That
street.
must be so refreshing to speak to them.
Yeah, it was.
Mm.
And what's refreshing is when they act like normal people,
Mm.
not come like a bull in the gate.
Mm.
I some of them are so rude in their approach. Um, the other thing that I find incredibly interesting is that the police officers, by and large, don't wear their name badges any longer.
No, no, it's all numbers, isn't it?
They only wear their numbers, and yet, if you go to the AFP website, it says quite clearly that if the police officers have to, when asked, give their name, their rank, and where they're attached, which station or which
Mm.
division they're attached to. Good luck getting that.
Yeah.
The reason I find this interesting